Welcome, this is YeHuDaH, and we're here for part 2 on my series on the divine name. We're going to take a look at what Jewish history records about the pronunciation of the divine name. And there's actually many Hebrew writings that talk about the pronunciation of the divine name, and they tell us a number of things. They tell us that there's multiple ways to say the divine name, and these ways are very well known and very well recorded, despite what a lot of people have told you. The only problem is that a lot of these documents have never been translated into English before, which is one of the reasons why a lot of English-speaking people don't know about these documents. But there's an awful lot that has been recorded in Jewish history about how to say the divine name. We're going to take a look at what those documents have to say. I'm going to show you a lot of those documents and what they are saying. And we're going to find out that an awful lot of myths that are believed about the divine name are going to show to just crumble under the weight of the evidence that you're about to see in this lesson. Among the myths that have been told is that Jews quit saying the divine name after the Babylonian captivity. And so when the Masorets wrote it down about 1,400 years later, nobody had said the divine name in 1,400 years. That was the first time they wrote it down. And so what they ended up writing down was euphemisms because nobody knew how to say the divine name. And, of course, the Masoret Tanach is the only place where the divine name was ever written down with vowels. And as a result of that, nobody really knows how to say it, and what was written there was wrong. And we've got to figure out how to say the divine name through English logic and English text and the evidence that is available in English history. Now, all of those things, even though that is commonly held to be believed by many Christians, many people in English-speaking society, all of those things are false. I'm going to prove to you that those things are false through a number of Hebrew documents I'm going to show you in this lesson. However, the truth of the matter is that it takes a while to actually master how to pronounce the divine name. And one of the things you're going to have to realize is that it takes some time and some study to say it correctly and to know how to say it in the right situations. And that's something we're going to take a look at upcoming. However, in this lesson, we're going to take a look at showing that these myths are wrong and showing some of the pronunciations that history understands. Actually, the halakha about how to say the divine name actually evolved over time. Now, one thing that is definitely true is that it has always been understood that it should not be spoken outside of Hebrew. In other words, the only time that you say the divine name is when you're speaking Hebrew and you say it in an otherwise Hebrew sentence. After the Babylonian captivity, they did decide not to speak it in public because they did learn something then. They learned that Aramaic speakers can follow enough of Hebrew that they can hear the divine name, recognize that that's the name, but a lot of times they would say it wrong. Now, a lot of people have heard that Jews quit saying the divine name in order to prevent Gentiles from blaspheming the name, and the logic that a lot of people have come to is that, well, if Gentiles know the name, they can say something about it. If they don't know the name, then they can't blaspheme it. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because if they're going to say something bad about God, they're just going to say it anyway. That's not the reason they quit saying the divine name. We're going to take a look at the real reason they quit saying the divine name in a little bit and why they quit saying it in public. But they didn't speak in public except at the temple. But you could still say the divine name in private prayer, and it was still used in many special communications, including rabbis when they were talking to their students, when scribes were talking to other scribes. And as late as 1140 A.D., the very famous work called Guide to the Perplexed says that the father is to teach his son how to say the divine name once every 7 years. Now, that's after the Masoret period. That's a good deal after the Masoret period. But not only was it considered permissible to say the divine name in 1140 A.D. when that was written, it was considered a commandment to say the divine name at a certain frequency and often enough that a father could teach his son how to say it. In fact, one of the things we're going to see, and I'm going to show you documents that prove this in a little bit, but many congregations were actually saying the divine name in public prayers in their congregations as late as the 18th century A.D. I'm going to show you examples of that if you don't believe that. You may think that that contradicts a lot of what you've been taught. But the complete ban on speaking the name at all, even in private prayer, anytime, anywhere, for any reason, is something that's actually a more modern development, because for many, many years it was believed that there were certain situations in which you did say the divine name, and that lasted much, much later than a lot of people believe. It was even after the Masoret period, and that's the most important part, is the fact that I can prove to you that that philosophy existed, that there were times you were supposed to say the divine name after the Masoret period. And I'm going to show you examples of that. But one of the first things you have to understand is that the divine name is not simple. And a lot of people, the information about the divine name sort of overwhelms people who are looking for simple answers. But we know that God told us as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, my thoughts higher than your thoughts, and we can add to that His name higher than our name, and His name is a lot more complex than our name. Because with my name is pretty simple. My name is Joseph. You can shorten it to Joe, and that's about all you need to know about my name. And basically, you can learn that, and you can start calling me Joe, and that's all the study we need to do about my name. But God's name is far more complex than that, because there are multiple ways to say it. That's not true of very many people. Hardly anybody has a name that can be pronounced multiple ways, but God's name has more than one way it can be said. It has more than one meaning, and sometimes even the same pronunciation has more than one meaning. I'm going to show you some examples of that a little bit later in this lesson. And there's actually multiple sources from which the meaning of the name is derived. One of them comes from grammar. There are grammatical constructions for the divine name that I'm going to show you in a moment. There are other sources from which the meaning of the divine name are derived that are built from understanding the meaning of the letters and the vowels that go with them. We're going to see that a lot in future lessons and a little bit in this one. I'm going to give you an introduction to that in this lesson, show you examples of that, but we won't get into the details of that until one of the future lessons that's in this series. First of all, let's talk about the grammatical structure of the divine name. Now, the divine name is built from the root YHWH. That is the Hebrew word that means to be, or usually translated is into English. And it's related to YeHuDaH, which is usually translated was. But when the divine name is pronounced Hoveh or Hoeh, then that is the masculine way of saying is. And we use that version of the verb is when we're dealing with a masculine noun. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a male person. It can be all nouns in Hebrew are either masculine or feminine. Even if you're talking about a pencil, it's going to be either masculine or feminine. And anytime the subject is masculine, when we use the word is with that, we say Hoveh or Hoeh. Now, in ancient Hebrew, it was probably said Hoeh. In modern Hebrew, it's said Hoveh. As many of you know, the vav can be pronounced either like a V or W sound in modern Hebrew, but in ancient Hebrew, I believe it was always pronounced like a W. The hovah or hoah is the feminine form of the verb is. Hiwa means to cause to be, and haya means was. Huwa means has become, and hawa or havava means evil. Now, the divine name comes from taking Hoveh or Hovah or Hiwa, any of the benevolent pronunciations of He-Vav-He, and combining that with the prefix Yud. Now, Hoveh is in the present tense. It is a present tense verb. It means to be right now. And when we combine that with the letter Yud, that is a prefix that puts it into the future tense. So, Hoveh means is. Yud puts it in the future tense, but it doesn't lose the present tense either, because it is both future and present tense. So in other words, you're saying that he is, but you're also saying that he will be. You're saying both of these things at the same time. And what YeHuDaH basically means is he will be the one who is. It's present tense, it's also future tense. And this is what it's actually built from. Now, there's multiple ways we can say the divine name that are legitimate. One is we can say he will be the one who is. And we can say that in the masculine form. We can say that in the feminine form. We can also say he who causes to be. Because when we take hiwa, which means to cause to be, and add a yud in front of that, then what you're essentially saying is he who causes to be. And that certainly fits a correct description of the Almighty, because he caused everything to be, which is. Now, you might think that the correct form of he who is would be the first one I've got on here, which is the masculine form. However, what we're actually going to find is that the feminine form is used quite a bit, even more frequently than the masculine form. I'm going to show you examples of that. Some people are going to look at that and say that that's wrong. And the reason a lot of people, a lot of English speakers are going to think that that's wrong is because in English we wouldn't use it that way. In English, masculinity and femininity are used for only one of two things, and that's to describe the differences between men and women, and that's all they're ever used for in English. But in Hebrew, masculinity and femininity are used for many more things than that. Masculinity is used to refer to completeness. Femininity is used to refer to incompleteness. Masculinity is used to refer to providing. Femininity is used to talk about containing things. And when we talk about the Almighty, of course, He is the provider, which is a masculine concept, but He also contains all things, and He created that which contains all things. And so it's not incorrect to attribute feminine attributes to God because containing things is considered a feminine attribute. And it's not as though that doesn't apply to God. But Hebrew uses the concepts of masculine and feminine for more things than just gender, which is the only thing we use it for in English. And so this confuses English readers or English listeners who are very, very accustomed to thinking you say masculine and feminine, and immediately they think of the differences between the two genders. But that's not the only thing that these concepts are used for in Hebrew thought. They're used for even more things than that. It's used for a dichotomy of things. Masculine and femininity are used for a dichotomy of things that complement each other in Hebrew thought, not just simply the role of the two genders. And what we're going to find is that really this mixed gender version of He Who is the one that is used most frequently in Hebrew writings. Linguistic gender and biological gender do not have to be the same thing in Hebrew. In Psalms 34:2, David says, "My soul shall make her boast." Now, is he calling his soul a her? Is he saying that he's a woman? No, that's not really what he's saying there. That's just simply there because the word soul is a feminine word. And it seems that the proper pronoun to replace it would be a feminine pronoun, even though he is a man. But that is another example where linguistic gender does not necessarily have to equate to biological gender in Hebrew. Now, in the Masoret Tanach, we find that there are two pronunciations that are used the most. And I've got both of these on the screen right here. One of them is the one that means He Who Is that I just got done talking about, and that appears over 6,500 times in the Masoret Tanach. The other one is YeHuDaH with the vowels for Elohim, and that's used a little over 300 times in the Masoret Tanach. Now, a lot of people have come to the conclusion that these vowels are wrong and that they're only there as euphemisms because when you see YeHuDaH with the vowels of Elohim, you're supposed to pronounce Elohim. And when you say YeHuDaH with the vowel sounds for He Who Is, that you're supposed to be saying Adonai, and that those are the vowels for Adonai. Now, one of the problems with that theory is that those aren't the vowels for Adonai. And that explanation is wrong because those aren't the correct vowels for Adonai. Let's take a look and compare the two. On this screen, I've got the Hebrew word Adonai, and I've also got the divine name. And you'll notice when you look at these that the last vowel is the same. It's a kamatz in both cases. The middle vowel is the same. It's a cholam in both cases. But the first vowel is not the same. Because in the case of Adonai, we've got a half patach. And in the case of the divine name, what we've got here is a schwa. So the first vowel that's used on these two names are not the same thing. And these vowels were not written down as a reminder to say Adonai. Yes, it is true that very frequently we say Adonai instead of saying the divine name. That is Jewish tradition. That is the custom that has been adopted. However, that is not the reason these vowels were written down. These are the correct vowels for how to say He Who Is. Now, what throws a lot of people off, and the reason a lot of people have rejected that notion, is due to the fact that these are the feminine vowels for saying He Who Is, and you're actually combining the feminine vowels with masculine concepts. So you're merging masculine and feminine together here, and a lot of people look at it and they say, well, that's erroneous. You can't do that. That's wrong. You're not supposed to do that. That even by the rules of Hebrew grammar, that violates Hebrew grammar. Well, hold on a minute. I'm going to show you examples where feminine vowels and masculine consonants are used together in Hebrew Scripture, and that there is recording that possibly in pre-Masoret times, there were examples in Scripture where this was done. Now, what I'm showing you here on the screen right now is a writing called Segulah Niflah. And what this is that it is a commentary on Psalms 20. And one thing you may notice, if you know enough Hebrew to know the alphabet and to know the vowels and to know how to pronounce letters, which is basically the typical bar mitzvah level of knowing Hebrew here in America, is to look at it, be able to pronounce it. If you know it to that level, then you might recognize that the divine name appears here and in another spot, and that what you've got here are two different pronunciations for the divine name. These two pronunciations are not the same, and neither pronunciation is the same as what we find in the Masoret Tanach. Now, it may take a slightly more trained eye to realize that there's two other places where the divine name appears in this document. However, these are actually permutations of the divine name, and it does refer to the divine name as well. Now, I want to talk about what this document has to say. However, since most of you who are listening to this probably can't read Hebrew, let me switch over to an English translation. And I've actually got an English translation of this commentary to Psalms 20 on my website. You can download it. You can read the entire commentary. And I'd encourage you to do that after you hear this, because that commentary is very insightful. It has a lot of very good information about the divine name. And what this commentary is it is Psalms 20 along with a commentary to Psalms 20. And it says at the very beginning of the document that it contains Psalms 20 with Adonai, YHWH, and Aleph He, Yud He, as they are intended to be spoken every time they appear in Psalms 20. And it's at the very beginning of it, of course, it had the divine name appears, and then there's a comment right after the divine name, because he says, this has been established with the name of Hashem, preserved with the vowels. Please continue preserving, my brother. And every time the divine name appears in this document, and it appears 7 times, by the way, it always appears with vowels. It's a different set of vowels each time. And every time it appears, he generally has a comment something like this. It's not the same comment each time. But every time the divine name is there, it has vowels, and he adds a comment to it that says something along the lines of, please preserve it, or please say this exactly as I've written it. And sometimes it contains warnings like, you better say it this way, or you're going to have to answer to God on Judgment Day if you don't. Okay? He encourages people to say it this way, and he sometimes warns them not to lose these pronunciations, but to keep them exactly the way they are. Now, what's significant about this is the divine name appears in this document 7 times. One of those times is the pronunciation for He Who Is that appears 6,500 times in the Masoret Tanach. That pronunciation is used here, but there's 6 other pronunciations that are used here, and it's obvious they didn't use that pronunciation as a euphemism for Adonai, because if they did, what about the other 6? I mean, they weren't afraid to use something that's not a euphemism the other 6 times, so there's no reason to conclude that the 7th time in which they used the pronunciation for He Who Is, that it is a euphemism for Adonai. Also, another thing that this points out is that the use of the feminine vowels with masculine consonants is normal, because he makes a comment in here in which he says, he said in the feminine tongue, and then he gives 4 words, and in three of these, he's actually got the vowels, and the 4th one appears to be missing, but it's probably just as legitimate that all 4 of these words probably originally, and 3 of them we could prove, the 4th one is probably true as well, that you have masculine consonants combined with feminine vowels. When it says, he will answer you, that is a case in which you've got masculine consonants, but you've got feminine vowels to go with them. Where it says, he will exalt you, it has masculine consonants, but feminine vowels to go with it. Now, this is not what we see in the Masoret Tanach. However, the writer of this commentary is commenting on this as if everybody knows this is what's in Psalms 20. Now, that's interesting, because that would suggest that either he wrote this before the Masoret Tanach, or that he wrote this, he may have written it after the Masoret Tanach, but maybe he wrote this about Psalms 20 using a text that he understood to be older than the Masoret Tanach, the Masoret version of Psalms 20. And as a result of that, he is saying, look, have you not noticed that here in Psalms 20, there are feminine vowels going with masculine consonants? Now, he may be drawing attention to this as a result of the fact that some people thought this was erroneous. But it's not erroneous, because when we are talking about God, these examples right here, plus there's another one later on. There's another one with the word for support, in which it's describing an action God is doing, and it uses feminine vowels with masculine consonants. It uses this mixed gender words when describing what God is doing. Now, it doesn't always use mixed gender words when describing what God is doing, but it does do it some of the time. And there is obviously a reason for that. We may not necessarily know what the reason is, but what we do know is that this is normal, that this is okay. And again, I do believe that the reason for this is due to the type of thing I said earlier. Like I said, masculinity is associated with providing, femininity with containing. There's other dichotomous concepts like that that go with masculinity and femininity, and it's really an attempt to say that God is both of these things, the provider and the container. He is all of these things, and it is for this reason that we are seeing feminine vowels with masculine consonants. This is not erroneous. This is actually something that is unique to God and something that can only happen when God is the subject involved. This is something that is getting across to us the uniqueness of God and how He is superior to all humans on this planet, because this can't happen with any individual. This can't happen with a human being who is on this planet. But it does happen with God, and it can only happen with God. And that is the important part to this. And that is why this writing shows us that to use feminine vowels with masculine consonants, which is what happens with He Who Is in the Masoret Tanach, is not erroneous, but it is indeed normal when you look at what is in here in Segulah Niflah. Now, Segulah Niflah uses 7 different pronunciations for YeHuDaH, vowel, one of them being He Who Causes to Be, another one being He Who Is, the most common pronunciation found in the Masoret Tanach. And it goes on to say, and gives some instructions that say, when a man is in trouble, whether alone or whether with many, he should say this psalm 12 times. And also teachers likewise will say it to their students, and corresponding to this psalm, he will answer you with all the purpose of the previous scriptures and also the vowels of the name as above. So he's saying in his commentary, teachers are to teach their students this psalm. They're to say it. They're to respond by saying it exactly the way the vowels are in here. Now, that blows away the theory that Jews were not supposed to speak the name. This is one piece of evidence that shows that teachers are supposed to teach students how to say it, and that they are indeed supposed to pronounce it. That the ban did not, that a complete ban of never saying it under any circumstances did not exist. Now, how old is this? Is something a lot of you might be wondering. Well, this has been published several times in several different volumes of work, and every time it's been, several of the times it's been published along with another writing whose date we know. That other writing is, of course, the Prophecies of the Child, which dates back to 497 AD. We know the exact year that was written. Now, whether this dates back to 497 AD or not, I don't know. Could it date back to that? Maybe, maybe not. Why was it included with that? Well, I don't really want to get into that discussion at the moment. But what I do want to get across is that maybe what's important about this isn't as much how far does it go back, but how far forward in time it goes. Because one of the places where this work was published was in Shulchan Aruch. Now, a lot of you may already realize that Shulchan Aruch was kind of the Talmud of the 16th century, because it is a work that has definitely been considered by modern-day Judaism as legitimate. It was published, again, in the 16th century, and it's so important to Jewish history that the publication of Shulchan Aruch defines the end of the Rishonim period. Judaism divides its own history up into various periods. The end of the Rishonim period is defined by the publication of Shulchan Aruch, and this is in Shulchan Aruch. So that is very significant, because that means that as late as the 16th century, Jews were encouraging other Jews to actually pronounce the divine name. That is a very significant thing to know, because the complete ban on saying the divine name under any circumstances, for any reason, anytime, anywhere, is actually a very modern ideal. Modern-day Judaism may teach it that way. But as late as the 16th century, Shulchan Aruch was encouraging teachers to teach their students to pronounce the divine name just like it is in this document. How old is it? I don't know. But how new it is very significant because it means that as late as that date, that was still the halakha that was understood about pronouncing the divine name. Now, this has been published in other documents as well, even since then. It's been published in the 18th century. It's been published after that. It's been published a number of times. So this is not a rogue document. It is a document that has been very well accepted in Jewish tradition, very well promoted, and even since the 16th century, it's been republished several times. Very important document, and it's only in our modern times, really, that Jewish tradition has shifted to not saying the divine name at all. But there are many manuscripts that even go as late as the 18th century that I'm going to show you some examples of that do indeed encourage people to say the divine name and to say it out loud and to say it according to an understood pronunciation. I have a complete English translation of this at my website. I'm going to encourage you to go download it, read the whole thing after you finish listening to this. Now, here on the screen, I've got another piece of Jewish liturgy. This is a piece of Jewish liturgy that has the divine name in it 3 times. And it also has, again, 3 different pronunciations in very close proximity to each other. That's the reason I picked this document to show to you. And you'll notice here that it has 3 different pronunciations. And in parentheses, it's actually describing how to say the divine name each of these 3 times. The first time, what it says is, you've got YeHuDaH, and then in parentheses it says, with the vowels of mach-shabah. And the second time, it's got YeHuDaH, and in parentheses it says, with the vowels of tehorah. Now, what that means is this. What that means is that you're supposed to say the divine name using the vowels that are in those words. In other words, that second time where he says, with the vowels of tehorah, then the 3 vowels there are the shwa, the cholam, and the kamatz, and that what he's saying is that you're supposed to use those 3 vowels for under the yud, the hey, and the vav when you pronounce yud, hey, vav, hey. That's what it's saying, and that you're supposed to pronounce it that way. The third time in this liturgy, it doesn't give a word. What it does, it spells out the names of the vowels. It says yud, hey, vav, hey, and then in parentheses, with the vowels of patach, shvah, kamatz, segul. In other words, it's giving you the 4 vowels that you're supposed to put under yud, hey, vav, hey. Now, it's not using Masoret vowels here to explain to you how to say the divine name. And a lot of people have argued that since the vowel pointings weren't invented until the Masoret period, that nobody had a way of writing down how to say the divine name until the Masoret period. Well, that's just wrong, because there's a number of ways you can write down on a piece of paper how to pronounce the divine name. And what you're seeing in this document right here are 2 ways that you can write down on a piece of paper how to say the divine name without using Masoret vowels. One of them is to use a word that has the same vowels as the way you're telling someone to pronounce the divine name. Another one is to spell out the names of the vowels that you're supposed to use. Both of those are ways that were used. In pre-Masoret times, they may have written it like this, or they may have put this information out in the margin, or there's a lot of ways you can record it, but there's a lot of ways you can explain to someone how to say the divine name without using Masoret vowels. So that logic is really way far off. Now, this piece of liturgy also appears in Shem Tov Katan. I've got that on the screen now so that you can see it. This is exactly the same thing as what you had before, but it's a better manuscript. It's a better document. It's a more readable document. And this one's actually typeset, and you can, and it also includes the Masoret vowels, so that makes it a little bit easier for you guys to read. I think this is enough document. This is just a sampling of what's out there, because there is one document after another, after another, after another. I could show you, I mean, if we could stand up here for hours, and I could show you Hebrew documents where you've got examples of the divine name being used. I could show you multiple pronunciations. I could show you the most common pronunciation in the Masoret Tanach, side by side with other pronunciations. And the fact that it's side by side with other pronunciations proves that that pronunciation is legitimate, because if it was intended to be a euphemism for Adonai, then the other pronunciations would be euphemisms as well, but that's not the case. Not only is the most common pronunciation from the Masoret Tanach, it has an understood meaning. Again, it means he who is. The other pronunciation of YeHuDaH with the vowel sounds for Elohim also is understood to have meaning in Hebrew. Now, I cannot explain to you that meaning from a Hebrew grammar table. I can explain to you the most common Masoret pronunciation from a grammar table. That's easy. We can go through the grammar. We can construct the meaning. We can explain it. It's very easy to explain. YeHuDaH with the vowel sounds for Elohim is a different matter, because grammatically I can't explain to you what it means, but it is understood to have meaning. What you're seeing on the screen right now is an excerpt from Pardes Rimonim, and I've highlighted what it says in the Hebrew in Pardes Rimonim, and to the right there's also an English translation of that. It says, and the name of Binah is the name of the son of the tetragrammaton with the vowels of Elohim. So this is associating that pronunciation. It's associating the pronunciation of YeHuDaH with the vowels of Elohim with the Son. Now, that's very significant. And however, let me warn you about something here. In Pardes Rimonim is one of the few documents I'm going to show you here that actually has been translated into English. And there was a fellow who translated it in 2007. But he translated it a little bit differently. He translated it by saying the name of understanding is the tetragrammaton punctuated like Elohim. So he kind of took the phrase son of YeHuDaH and just called it, and did not tell you that it's saying son of YeHuDaH in here. He left that out. He just said the tetragrammaton instead. And this is another problem whereby Hebrew documents that record this kind of information frequently don't translate it into English exactly the way you need to see it. Here, this was translated this way because sensitive information, such as admitting to the fact that God has a son, is something that modern-day Hebrew scholars don't want the average person to really see, because this is an area where modern Jewish thought and ancient Jewish thought don't agree with each other. Ancient Jewish thought is full of references to the Son of God, but in modern Jewish thought, they don't like that, so they tend to not translate that phrase when they translate Hebrew writings into English. And there's also sometimes when documents get translated into English, if it's a 200-page document, 5 pages talk about how to pronounce the name of God, they may choose to just simply not translate those 5 pages. And the reason for that, of course, is due to the philosophy that since the divine name is only supposed to be said in a Hebrew sentence, and you never say it when you're not speaking Hebrew, then there's no reason to ever translate those 5 pages into English, because English speakers don't need to know that information. I mean, if you can't speak Hebrew, you don't need to know that information anyway, because it violates halakha to say it that way. Therefore, there's no point in translating it. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of the information that's out there about how to say the divine name is stuff that English speakers have never read, because it's never been translated in English, or on those rare occasions which it often hasn't been translated completely. Let me show you another example of this type of thing. This is another piece of liturgy that's got 2 pronunciations. One says with the vowels of Malkut, the other that says with the vowels of Elohim. Now, of course, this is another example of where YeHuDaH, pronounced like Elohim, is supposed to be pronounced that way. And the Malkut pronunciation, that's another name for YeHuDaH as it means he who is. That's, again, another reference to the most common pronunciation of the divine name. So far, we've taken a look at a couple different things. We have taken a look at several grammatical pronunciations of the divine name. We've taken a look at how to say he who causes to be. We've also taken a look at how to say he will be the one who is. And I've shown you examples of where these are used in several ancient Hebrew documents. We have also taken a look at there are other pronunciations, and we've taken a look at one of those. We've taken a look at YeHuDaH with the vowels of Elohim, and that's in the Masoret Tanach, it's in Pardes Rimonim, it's in Tikkun Tefillot. Of It's in many, many other documents that I haven't shown you as well. But there are a number of pronunciations that are understood to have a meaning, and they are reserved for a particular purpose. And we can't explain them grammatically, but they do exist. Here's another good example. On the Day of Atonement, the divine name was spoken as you see it appear here on the screen with these vowels. And it was only used on the Day of Atonement and only used by the high priest. And that's something that made this pronunciation very special because it was very, very rare. And, of course, the Day of Atonement is supposed to be unlike any other day. It's a very solemn day. It is a very special day. And to make that, one of the things that made that day more special was this was the only day in the year where this pronunciation was ever used. You weren't supposed to use it any other time. And this pronunciation actually does have a meaning that does describe to us God's covering of our sins. Now, I'm not going to get into that in this lesson. I do expect to get into that in one of the future lessons that's in this series. And I'm going to explain to you how it means what I've just explained to you it means. And you'll see that in a little bit more detail. But there are plenty of places where pronunciations that are non-grammatical do have meaning. Let me show you another pronunciation that is very well recorded and has an understood meaning. This is found also in Pardes Rimonim, and this is one of the few examples of something similar to this that actually has been translated into English. But it says, it is furthermore written in Tikkunim, he is called, and then you've got YeHuDaH, Vav, with the kamatz, the vowel kamatz there 4 times. And it says, he is called this from the upper crown because he is concealed like a closed fist, whose outside does not know the higher soul inside. But he who is inside in thought and is called the cause of all causes, like a closed fist that conceals, and no one knows what is inside. It is said, he who is inside. So in other words, what they're saying is they're giving you yet another pronunciation of the divine name, and they're telling you that this is interpreted as meaning he who is inside. Now, in some ways, this takes some explaining, okay? Because we got to get inside their head a little bit to understand what they mean by he who is inside. That's one way to say it. You could also say he who is beyond or he who is concealed is the essence of what they're trying to say. But the reason they've worded it this way is because in Hebrew, many of you already know, some of you may not know, but for the sake of you who don't, the Hebrew word olam can be translated several different ways. It can be translated world, it can be translated age, it can also be translated hidden. And the reason it can be translated either world or hidden is because Judaism believes that every world hides the next world, that God created many, many worlds, and each world hides the other world, okay? And that the physical world we live in hides the spiritual world. Now, it doesn't box it in. It doesn't contain it. It's not like the spiritual world is thrown inside this box of the physical world, and it's restricting its movement. Because when we think of inside, we think of being inside a box or being inside of a prison. And that's not really the sense in which they're using the word inside here. Okay, they're using the word inside in the sense that one thing hides what's inside of it. And they're using inside in order to describe the hidden quality of that other world that exists. But it doesn't mean contain or anything like that. Because when we talk about one world being inside of another, we don't really mean it's physically inside. What we mean is that it's concealed. It's inside in the sense that something on the outside hides what's on the inside. Yeah, that's what the many worlds do. Each world is hidden inside of another world. However, you could also say it's hidden beyond the other world because it's not really contained. It's not really confined, but it's in another whole dimension. So when they say he who is inside, what they really mean by that is he who is beyond, he who is concealed, that type of thing. And so that pronunciation of the divine name is understood to refer to God as he is hidden beyond the world we see. We can't see him in this world, but we do know he's there. He is hidden in another dimension from us. And that pronunciation of the divine name describes the way he is hidden from us in another dimension. That's what Pardes Rimonim is trying to get across to us. Although that's not really clear because there's 2 things you have to keep in mind here. There is the literal translation of this text, which was originally written in Aramaic, into English. But there's also getting inside their thought, understanding phraseology and terminology is another thing entirely. Because not only do we use different words to describe the same thing, but a lot of times we use different terminology, different phraseology to describe various abstract thoughts. And that's kind of what's going on here, because in Aramaic, they're using some phraseology, some terminology that's we probably would say a little bit differently in English. And that's why sometimes paraphrasing something that's in another language may give the reader a more accurate description than literally translating it, because we don't always use the same phraseology or terminology as what they use, even with the same types of physical examples. This is not the only place where this pronunciation is used. It doesn't just simply appear in parties from me. It appears in a lot of Jewish liturgy. Here's another example from Bet Menuchah, where we see both YeHuDaH with the most common pronunciation from the Masoret Tanach, along with the one I just got to describing to you, whose pronunciation is understood to mean he who is hidden beyond in another realm. Okay? And both of those pronunciations appear on this page. And in reality, immediately after what you see on this page, Bet Menuchah goes on to use 9 other different pronunciations of the divine name immediately after what you see here on the screen. They all have meaning. They all have purpose. They all convey some sort of meaning to us. And I'm going to be talking about those pronunciations in one of my later lessons on this series. And I'm going to be talking about what some of those other pronunciations mean. I'm going to get into all 10 of the ones that Bet Menuchah really uses. But I'm not going to get into it on this lesson, because right now we're just trying to concentrate on establishing the fact that these pronunciations exist and that they all have understood, well-known, well-documented meanings. Now, some of you are going to look at this multitude of meanings and say, wow, there's like 10 pronunciations or 20 pronunciations. I mean, how many are there? Well, that's something that rabbis, I've heard 70, I've heard some people say 72. The highest number I've heard is that there's 86 different pronunciations. And some of you might look at this and say, well, if there's like 80 some odd, 70 or 80 some odd pronunciations, I ought to be able to just pick just about anything and it'll work, right? Well, wrong. That's not accurate at all. And if we really ask ourselves, how many different ways can you say the divine name? Well, let's count them up. I'm going to count them up for you here. There's actually 12 different vowels. And when I say 12 vowels, I'm counting short, long, and half vowels as distinct. And they should be counted as distinct because they're not necessarily always, they're not going to be the same, pronounced the same way. So if we go with each distinct pronunciation, there are 12 different ways we can say the various vowels in Hebrew with a yud and with a hey. And then underneath the vav, there's also 12 vowel sounds that we can use, although they're not all the exact same 12 vowel sounds we might use with a yud or with a hey. But let's add it all up. How many different ways can you pronounce the divine name? Well, 12 times 12 times 12 times 12, which comes out to 20,736 different ways to phonetically pronounce yud, hey, vav, hey, and make an audibly heard sound out of your mouth using those consonants. However, the highest claim about how many of those 20,000 are valid that I've heard from anybody is 86. Now, 86 sounds like a lot of pronunciations when you're comparing it to one, but it's not very many when you're comparing it to 20,000. Because when we really translate this to a percentage, that means that only 0.41% of the possible phonetic sounds that could be used to verbalize the divine name, only 0.4% of them are considered to be valid. So if you just pluck a pronunciation out of thin air, there's a 99.6% chance you're getting it wrong. Those aren't very good odds, folks. That's why you don't want to just simply pluck a pronunciation out of thin air and expect it to work and expect it to be meaningful. And one of the reasons you don't want to do that is because one of the commandments that was given was, do not, in English it says, do not take my name in vain, but in vain there is actually lashwa in Hebrew, and what that means is for nothing or for, and you could, I guess it's a matter of interpretation whether you're saying for no purpose or what. We tend to think of swearing as using his name in vain, but that's not the only way his name could be used for no purpose. Certainly anytime you use his name for an illegitimate purpose, that would fall under that category. But what if you say his name in such a way that it has no meaning? Is that also lashwa? Well, it certainly could. I think that you could legitimately interpret that, and that's at least one reason why you should not just pluck any pronunciation out of thin air and say the divine name that way. Stick with a pronunciation that you know is legitimate and that has been well recorded in history as being valid. Don't just make one up, folks. Okay? That's wrong. You do not want to do that. And of course, I'm going to give you all several reasons not to say the divine name at all, but particularly when you're speaking English. But if you do decide to say it for any reason, don't just pluck something out of thin air. Now, there are a lot of people that have come up with wrong ideas simply because they haven't taken the time to learn Hebrew. And you need to, if you're going to say the divine name, you've got to take time to learn how Hebrew vowels are pronounced and how and so forth, and the way the grammar works, because without that, you're going to think you know how to say the divine name, and you won't really know how to say it. But a lot of people have come to wrong conclusions because their English mindset has biased them towards the idea that they have to say the divine name, and that it would be wrong not to say it, and that they have all the information they need in English to say it correctly. And one of the arguments I've heard made, and I've heard a lot of people say this, they say, well, the first vowel's got to be an ah sound because Yah is the short form, and therefore the first vowel that we use has got to be an ah sound. Well, that's not really true, okay? And that is an attempt to read English logic into a Hebrew problem. Because in English, when we take a long name like Joseph, like my name, and we shorten it to something, we might shorten it to just Joe, because typically the way we shorten names is we take the first syllable and we discard the rest of the name. But let's suppose we lived in a society where short forms were derived a little bit differently. Let's suppose we lived in a society where we took the first consonant and the last syllable and we shortened Joseph to Jeff instead of shortening it to Joe. Would you still try to make the argument that the first vowel sound has got to be an ah? Those same people would probably be making an argument that the last vowel sound is ah, and we just need to figure out the first two. Okay? But it's your own English culture that has biased you to thinking that there is something legitimate about that. Now, in Hebrew, it doesn't work either way. And I'm going to give you an example of how it doesn't work either way. All of you know what the word Tanak, or a lot of you know what the word Tanak means. Tanak is the Hebrew Scriptures, right? It is the Bible. And it comes from, what, 3 words? It comes from Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, which means the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Now, we don't shorten that to Tanak, okay? At the Torah, we don't shorten Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim to Tanak. We shorten it to Tanak. We do not preserve the vowels that are in the original 3 words at all. I mean, we just discard them and come up with something totally different. And much like Tanak doesn't contain the vowels from what it is abbreviation from, you cannot make the presumption that due to the fact that there's a short form called Yah, that this in any way, you really can't even presume that there's an ah sound underneath any of the letters of the divine name. No, based on that. Because Hebrew logic doesn't work the same way as English logic does. It's just very different. And you need to learn how Hebrew thinking works before you try to start reconstructing the divine name. I mean, if you cannot read Hebrew, if you cannot speak Hebrew, if you do not understand Hebrew grammar, then you are not going to be the guy to tell thousands of years of Hebrew speakers that they've been saying the divine name wrong, and you, as an English speaker who doesn't know Hebrew, have figured out the correct way to say it. I mean, that's just fallacious thinking, and that's probably both arrogant and presumptuous to think that an English speaker who doesn't know Hebrew is going to be able to tell Hebrew speakers where they're going wrong with pronouncing the divine name. That's just simply not going to happen. If you don't know Hebrew grammar, Hebrew pronunciation, Hebrew logic, then you're not the guy to correct thousands of years of rabbis on how to say the divine name. Another very common error is what I call the YeHuDaH error, and that's where people have taken the word YeHuDaH and said, hey, there's only one letter difference here. Why, we just get rid of the dalet, use the same vowels, and we've got a pronunciation for the divine name. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. Okay. Now, irregardless of how much sense this might make to you, It makes absolutely no sense at all in Hebrew thought. The reason it makes no sense at all is because the hey at the end of YeHuDaH is grammatical. Okay, whereas the hey at the end of YHWH is not grammatical. It is a root letter. And as a result of that, there's a different set of rules that determine what vowels you stick underneath root letters versus what vowels you stick under a grammatical suffix. Those two things are operated under a different set of rules. And hey vav dalet is grammatically altered by a whole different set of rules than hey vav hey, because they're not in the same class of words whatsoever. So within the realm of Hebrew logic, this makes absolutely no sense at all. Worst of all, this comes up with, if you remember what I said earlier about how YeHuDaH means has become, if you pronounce the divine name this way, then what you may actually be saying is the pu'al form, the third person pu'al form of the divine name, which is essentially means he who has become. Now, that is not something you want to say about our Creator, but this is what you end up with, or when you try to apply English logic to a Hebrew circumstance, you end up with something that is goofy and wrong and something you don't want to say. And this is why the rabbis quit saying the divine name. This is why they began just simply saying, no, we need to not say the divine name. We need to tell everybody not to say the divine name. It's because goofy stuff like this was going on. And goofy stuff like this is still going on today, because there's a lot of people who seem to think that they can figure out how to say the divine name without learning Hebrew at all. That's not going to happen. There are various sources of meaning for the divine name. Now, I have explained to you how the divine name is built from grammar, and when it is built from grammar, it's understood to refer to his eternalness. I mean, we could take Yod He Vav He and say this means he who is, or he will be the one who has become, or we could also translate it the eternal one, because that's essentially what it's saying. And the fact that it refers to the multiple tenses of his existentiality is something that's been very well recorded throughout history. For example, Philo said the divine name means he who is, and of course he was writing back in the 1st century A.D. He was born 1st century B.C., so that dates it to pre-gospel times. Now, I would definitely encourage people not to say the divine name unless they're saying it in Hebrew. Usually they're saying it in Hebrew, and unless they can certainly speak Hebrew, for sure. Now, if you decide not to take that advice, let me give you a few caveats about pronouncing the divine name, and a few reasons why you shouldn't say the divine name, and some things that you need to overcome before you even think about saying it. Some of the pronunciations are blasphemous or nearly so. And I've given you a few examples. I mean, there's one way to say it in which you say he who is evil. Another way to say it is saying he who has become. Another way of saying it says he who causes himself to be. You don't want to say any of those things. But the reason Jews quit saying it was because they would say the divine name, and they would be saying he who is when they say it. Someone else would hear that. They would mispronounce it. They'd end up saying he who is evil. And that's why history tells us they quit saying the divine name, because Gentiles were blaspheming God. It's not because of what most people have presumed. It's because you can mispronounce the divine name so as to say something blasphemous, and they didn't want people to mispronounce the divine name so as to say something blasphemous, but the slightest slip of the tongue can change he who is to he who is evil, because they didn't want Gentiles to be blaspheming God by mispronouncing the divine name, so that you say one of those meanings that is indeed blasphemous. So some pronunciations are blasphemous. Some pronunciations are problematic. For example, there's a way to pronounce the divine name so as to say he who allows to be. Now, that has some philosophical problems, because sometimes he does allow things to just take their natural course, but he is not a God who just sits up there ignoring this world and letting everybody do their own thing and not answering prayers and not doing anything about what's happening in this world. You do not really want to be conveying that image of God to other people. And so you wouldn't really want to use that pronunciation as a general description of him. I mean, there are times when he does just simply allow things to be. But philosophically, you could see there's a problem with that pronunciation and not the general name that we would want to call God, even though that's not necessarily something that's blasphemous, although someone could use it with a blasphemous intent. Now, some pronunciations have reserved meanings. For example, I told you about the one pronunciation only used on the Day of Atonement. You would never want to use that another time. Some pronunciations have reserved meanings. Okay, there are some pronunciations you would use them in a certain context and not in other contexts. And I'm going to get into that concept a little bit more in one of the future lessons on this series. I'm not going to get into that now. But when you hear that lesson, you're going to understand why, again, there are some pronunciations that it's fitting to use them in a certain context. It's not fitting to use them in a different context. You need to know you need to know what context fits each pronunciation. Now, one example that I can give you is that he who is, it's probably always appropriate to use he who is. But if you're praying to God saying, God, please change my circumstances, it may be more appropriate for you to say he who causes to be. Because you don't want him to keep your circumstances the way they are and eternally allow them to stay that way. You want him to change your circumstances and cause them to be something different than what they are right now. So it may be more appropriate to refer to God as he who causes to be rather than he who is. And that's one of the reasons why ancient Jewish thought did encourage speaking in the divine name in private prayer, but using the appropriate pronunciation for the appropriate circumstances. We're going to learn what the appropriate pronunciation is in certain circumstances in some of the future lessons that I am doing on this series. So stay tuned and be sure to listen to the next set of series on this lesson in order to hear me explaining what some of those pronunciations are for some of those circumstances. We're going to get into that, okay? But you don't necessarily use the same pronunciation for every single generic circumstance. Also, you've really got to learn how to pronounce Hebrew. Well, a lot of people think they know the pronunciation better than they do. Because they think, I'll just take the divine name, I'll transliterate it into English letters, and then I'll know how to say it. Well, no, it doesn't really work that way, and I'm going to explain to you why. There are three vowels that we translate as an A, an English A, but they're not the same three vowels, okay? They're pronounced differently. The patak, the kamatz, and the half patak are three different pronunciations, but we write all three of those pronunciations very frequently as an A in Hebrew, and actually the kamatz is even more complicated than that because sometimes it's an A sound, sometimes it's an O sound, okay? But we write all of them as an A, but they're not all an A sound. They are three separate sounds. They are not the same three sounds. They are three separate sounds. It's just that English ears can't hear the difference, okay? Because we don't make all three of these sounds in English. You can't necessarily relate them to an English equivalent. Instead, you've got to understand Hebrew, you've got to understand how Hebrew is pronounced, and you've got to understand the pronunciation of these in Hebrew thought, in a Hebrew context with Hebrew pronunciation, not trying to transliterate this into English. The same is true of the E vowel, because there are four different vowels that we might write as an E in English. There is and I've got all four of those here on the screen. And again, they are not pronounced the same way in Hebrew. These are four different pronunciations in Hebrew. They are not one pronunciation. They are four different pronunciations in Hebrew. You don't say them the same way. You've got to know the difference, and you've got to know the difference from an Hebrew context. If you don't know the difference between open and closed vowels in Hebrew, then you're not ready to say the divine name. And if what I just said to you is a new idea and something that you haven't heard before, and you don't know what open and closed vowels are in Hebrew, then you're not ready to say the divine name. And you've got to know the difference, because if you don't know that difference, then it's very easy to say he who is evil. It's very easy to use that mispronunciation of the divine name. So you need to understand the difference between the open and closed vowels and why that's important in Hebrew pronunciation. Now, as I said, these are a few caveats you need to think about before you say the divine name. Again, I would encourage you to follow the modern halakha on the divine name, at least publicly. Okay, at least publicly. I mean, if you want to say it in your private prayers, that's one thing. But at least learn to say it right, learn to say it in Hebrew, so forth. Now, in the future lessons, we're going to get into more of this. I'm going to get into other pronunciations. I'm going to get into what pronunciations you use in what circumstance according to Jewish tradition. But this, I hope, is enough to dispel some of the most common myths, because I have shown you some Hebrew documents that talk about pronouncing the divine name. I've shown you enough for you to see with your own eyes that Judaism does understand that there's multiple ways to say the divine name. that those multiple pronunciations have multiple meanings, that all of those meanings are valid and can be used within a given context. And like I said, again, we're going to get into more of that in the future lessons. But what I want you to take away from this one is the fact that much of what you've heard, of course, as far as the mythology about, well, Jews quit saying it, they therefore forgot how to say it, what the Masoret wrote down was just a euphemism, all that is wrong, folks. All of that is wrong. And the people who are saying that, they're saying that because they've never read these documents. And most of the time, 99% of the time, they haven't read these documents because they can't read Hebrew, and so as a result of that, they haven't read all these documents that have never been translated in English. In a few cases, a very small number of cases, maybe they had, but they didn't understand what they were reading because they were approaching reading that from a certain bias, a certain expectancy, and when what they read didn't fit, well, they just threw it off or considered it a rogue commentator, somebody who was out of line with Jewish mainstream. None of that is true, folks. The truth of the matter is that modern Jewish thought on this differs from ancient Jewish thought. Ancient Jewish thought was to say the divine name in your private prayer and in certain circumstances and in certain times, not necessarily all the time, not necessarily everywhere, but in certain times, it was said all the way up until basically a few hundred years ago was when the philosophy about this completely changed to never saying it under any circumstances. But the philosophy that was always the philosophy ever since Babylon captivity is just wrong. That's not the case. I've proven to you that that's not the case through what I've shown you here as well. Now, I would say that your next step, if you want to learn more about this, go to my website, download the dissertation that I've got on the divine name, in which I talk about some of the things. I go into a discussion about the grammar, and I break it down there in ways that you could see it on paper, in ways that are in some ways more detailed than what I talked about here. And it's got a complete translation of Segulah Niflah, which is a very worthwhile commentary to read. But also, I've talked about some things in here that I didn't go into in that writing as well, okay? Because here I've tried to show you things that the verbal aspect, the audio, and the visual elements can bring out. In that document, I bring out more of the types of things that are easier to talk about in written text. But I would say go download that, read that document next, and then move on to listening to the third lesson in this series. I want to thank you all and see you next time. Shalom.